Let's go, my Levia fans. This is Mansant, and today I'm joined by the lovely Levia herself to go over every single card that's going to have an impact in our deck building of Levia moving forward. Now, this set didn't drop anything that screams Levia. There were no Shadow Brute cards, no Shadow cards, so I do apologize. I think was a bit baited by the statement that every class would get cards. I thought that meant the subclasses as well in Shadow Brute, but that didn't happen. But even so, there were enough cards dropped that we should go over and talk about where they land in our decks and how we can make the best use out of them, because it's not all that obvious. So with that, let's jump into the breakdown. So the first card on the list is my spoiler card here in Swing Big, and I really do like this card. The more I thought about it, the more I had time to ruminate on it. It really will find its way in both Club and Claws Levia. And while it doesn't have any screaming Blood Debt synergy other than the fact that it is a 6 power attack, so banishing it of course is beneficial to you, it is just statted in a way that is really strong for both decks playstyles. So Club Levia specifically is going to absolutely love this card, and that's because off of a 2-card hand, when you pitch a blue and have a Tunic resource up, all of a sudden that arsenal could always threaten a pummel, or that extra card in hand, whatever it is, can always be a pummel when you have that 1 blue floating and that Tunic up. And your opponent is always going to then be hard pressed to think about how to correctly block this, because if they want to block it for the Quicken token, but then you punish them with a pummel, wow, you've just completely destroyed their game plan. So that is a really, really strong play that's now added to the club deck, as well as the late game damage that can be pushed when, same thing, you get to play this now off of pitching a blue with Convulsions, use Tunic resource to play Swing Big. Hopefully now you're coming in for 9 Dominate, which is a huge amount of damage to close the game, not to mention if you have a larger hand and can land pummels on top of that. So very, very strong card for Club Levia. That's definitely where it's going to shine. Now for Claws Levia, you definitely are still going to play this card, I think. The more I thought about it, the better it really is, and that's really all because it has a block value. So even if it's the point in the game where this card isn't great, you're really, really trying to turn off Blood Debt every turn, you need that to be your attack, you can at least still block with Swing Big, send it to your grave, and that's totally fine. But early game, when you play this, you love the stats on it because you are an aggressively oriented deck, so the more tradable 2-card hands that are just overstatted like this that can tilt the damage in your favor, the better. And on top of that, if your opponent does block heavily, gain that Quicken token, then what you've done really is bought yourself another turn to dig for the pieces that Levia needs. So you will have to kind of clench up. That Quicken token might be abused into you. You definitely don't want to run this in every matchup. You don't want to play it against like a Dorinthia, for example. But for the most part, I've actually really come to like this card for Claws, and I think it'll definitely have its slot in both builds. So very good card. So next on the list we have Skull Crushers, and this is a really interesting card because we haven't had a Brute equipment in the arm slot yet, and this is one that just baseline is going to add to the tankiness that Brute likes out of their equipment, especially Levia, because Levia has Carrion Husk, whereas Reinhard just still is lacking a really core chest piece that blocks well. All they really run is Tunic. So the Battle Worn one, definitely strong in just adding to that fridge of armor you can take, but the effect on this is really odd. Whenever you roll a 5 or 6, your Brute attacks are going to gain +1, and that's all attacks, even weapons. So automatically you're thinking, wow, this on a Claws turn would just be insane. All of a sudden, my Claws are going to come in for 4 attack each. If this is on a Blood Rush, that's like +3 damage across the board. That's fantastic. But you have to remember that when you are running this in your arm slot, you're going to lose Gambler's Gloves. And Gambler's Gloves is just so key for unlocking the potential of Scab Skins in Claws Levia, because you do have a lot of opportunities in the game when you have a lot of pressure on your opponent to just roll Scab Skins on your large hands and try to get those extra action points. But if you roll a 1, then you need the bailout that Gambler's Gloves gives. So I just don't think you're going to find Skull Crushers in Claws builds. It's not good enough. You could use it perhaps in like Blitz for the extra tankiness when the games are shorter anyway, but in Claws Levia, your Blood Debt can just get to the point where you need the bailout of Gambler's Gloves. However, in Club Levia, this card is very, very good. The extra tankiness is fantastic, and in that build, you don't really roll Scab Skins anyway, unless you have a huge amount of freedom to do so, because you don't have Blood Debt anyway, and then if you do roll a 5 or 6, the payoff's just that much better. Now, when you roll a 1, Skull Crushers does break, so just more punishment for just random luck, so that's a bit unfortunate. So you do want to make sure that you block that first hit effect that would be relevant with this Battle Worn 1, because you don't want to just lose this block on your first Scab Skins roll being a 1. So it's an interesting card, not going to find its slot in Claws, I don't think, but Club can definitely use it. Now, the next card here is actually a really, really interesting one. This isn't one that was officially spoiled. It was just dropped later in the box breaks. And I really wish this card had its moment to shine because I really like this one. So Rolling Thunder at a 1 cost, 3 block. It is majestic, so it only comes in this rate. You get to roll a 6-sided die. Your next brute attack this turn, attack, so even weapons, gains plus X, where X is the number rolled. So automatically, this card is just very strong in that it's going to apply to your weapons. It's another one of the Brute Toolkit cards now, like Barraging Beatdown or Primeval Bellow, that can now apply to your weapon. So that's really, really strong here because now off of a blue and this card, you could now swing in Club for at minimum 5, not great, but at maximum you could swing in for 11 now, because if you do hit a 6 on this and you are running Skull Crushers, that's going to gain the extra +1. All of a sudden your club comes in for 11 off 2 cards. So the ceiling on this card is fantastic. I don't think you're going to run this in Claws Levia because it just doesn't fit what you're trying to do, but in that slower weapon grind game plan that Club loves, this is a very, very strong card. So happy to see this. This is kind of the payoff that Skull Crushers needs because there's not a lot of other dice rolls in Brute that you would do aggressively other than Scabskins, but that one's really dependent on whether or not you can use action points anyway, and this is just an attack buff that would go on anything. So very, very fond of this card, and it will definitely see play. So next we have Arcane Lantern, and this is not a Brute card, but it's a card I'm really, really liking, at least in theory, for Claws Levia. And that's because Claws Levia always had an issue, especially when you were against Viscerai, in that losing a core piece of your equipment was really, really rough, because yes, you need Arcane Barrier, but to swap out just a singular piece felt really bad, and the best slot was most likely that Null Rune Hood piece because your head is your least important slot. You want Scabskins and Gamblers together, you want your Husk, of course, but then if you took Null Rune Hood, you all of a sudden were now sacrificing a lot more sideboard space because you still want Arcane Barrier 3 versus Wizard, and Skullhorn, of course, goes in that head slot. So then you were kind of forced to take a different Arcane Barrier piece and perhaps like Null Rune Gloves, and that just made it very, very awkward because when you're racing down a deck like Viscerai, you want to be able to roll Scabskins for the cheeky ghostly damage or whenever your hands are live for extra action points, but you just didn't have the freedom to do that when you didn't have Gambler's Gloves. So the trade-off here is that by running Arcane Lantern instead of your second claw, your Blood Rush turns will be worse, but you do have to remember that Viscerai, when he chucks those rune chants at you, is going to take a lot of resources out of your hand anyway, so your ability to have really good Blood Rush turns meant you were playing probably really, really greedy and just eating a lot of the previous turn's damage. So I don't think it's going to really affect how that matchup trades and what your game plan is. If anything, it just makes it stronger because now you do have access to Gamblers and Scabs. And on top of that, of course, this slot is really strong into the Wizard matchup when you run Arcane Barrier 3 in Skullhorn. Now you get the Arcane Barrier slot in your Mandible Claws, or next to your Mandible Claws, and this now, once again, leaves yourself open to Scabskins plus Gamblers to be as aggressive as possible when you find those recursion pieces, when you have a large hand to just go ham. So I hope this is actually the upgrade. I think it is. If it isn't, then we're just going to go back to running Null Rune Gloves and C'est la vie, but I think this is good. I like this in theory, and I definitely want to put a lot of testing into this, and especially pick up the Arcane Lantern full art because it looks gorgeous. So I'm liking this card personally. So then we've got Wild Ride, and Wild Ride is a card that fits into this weird space where the game developers are obviously trying to find where Brute cards kind of live in between Levia and Reinar's playstyle, and they decided upon this mechanic kind of back with Shadow of Blasphemfet in that drawing and then discarding a random card is how they're going to bridge the two gaps, because drawing and discarding means you actually are still like net equal with the cards that you have in hand, so it's not overly punishing for how Levia wants to play, and discarding is going to help fill your graveyard, whereas then Reinar gets to draw and discard these cards and trigger his Intimidate. So I think they like this design space and think it works in between how Reinar and Levia can use this Brute card pool, but I really don't like it. I try not to run a lot of these draw discard cards because they're also gated behind this no block as well. We see that in Shadow of Blasphemfet, we see that in Pulping, Deadwood Rumbler, and now Wild Ride, and the non-blocks are just so rough for Levia because you want these cards when they're not at a good point in the game to just be able to be block fodder, get into graveyard, and at least do something for you. So not a huge fan of this card, but the one thing it can do, at least because it would gain go again, is perhaps now you can slot into just a more aggressive Levia that has more consistent go again. You can run Wild Ride, Pulping, all alongside like Mandible Claws, and just try to go for these really, really wide turns where you can now come off with 12 damage off the back of a Wild Rider Pulping, hitting, discarding a blue, discarding another blue for 2 claw swings for 12. That's a pretty good play off of what would be just 3 cards. But there is randomness in that. Of course, when you're playing the draw discard, you always have the chance to miss your really, really important cards on that discard with like Blood Rush or Art of War, Doomsday. Really hate that. But maybe there's enough of this package now that you can kind of have an aggressively oriented claws deck that really likes to go second. And if that could come out of a card like this, that would actually be really, really strong. Because Levia is a deck that plays aggressively. And normally aggro in this game wants to go second, but she has a really hard time going second because she doesn't have a lot of cards in her deck that are playable on her first turn without anything in banish. So the more of these cards you add, the better she gets at that, and going second is just always great for that tempo trade. You're either dealing that upfront damage or taking cards out of her hand, and that's fantastic. So if you can build a deck now that has these cards that really excels at going second, then I think there might be something there. But just slotting these into like the normal claws build, I really, really, really don't like. The one last thing to mention here is that when you do run a build that draws and discards a lot, Mark the Beast actually gets a lot better, not only because it's a more aggressive card and that you don't need the banish 3 in graveyard to attack with it, but also because now when you discard this card, it still banishes, and that turns off your blood debt, and it now lets you play Graveling Growls. So Mark of the Beast at least is a little bit of Levia flavor we can add to this package that could make it pretty good, but time will tell whether that's where the claws build needs to go. More aggro, less mid-range. So overall, pretty mid on this card. So now we've really come to kind of the trash, the filth of the set, and there are quite a few of them for at least how Levia plays, no matter the club or claw playstyle, and that is Bare Fangs. Bare Fangs is similar to Wild Ride in that it's one of those non-blocks that draws and discards, but the payoff on this one is horrible, horrible, horrible. Coming in for just 8 off of a 2-card hand non-block. I mean, we could do that with Deadwood Rumbler, and it would just be infinitely better than Bare Fangs because it at least has some blood debt synergy. So you're just never going to run this card. It's not good. Bad Beats is another one that is just asking for high roll, and Levia is a deck that already has such pitfalls in her strategy. When you do get a bit unlucky, you don't want to then add more cards that can do that for you. I mean, you play a Bad Beats, roll a 1, 2, 3, you've wasted an entire card. That is just not good. The payoff's great, but you don't want to add more low roll potential in Levia at all. You want to make her more consistent, so I just would never run this card. High Roller, definitely more of a Rhinar card in that it has Intimidate to help stack with the other Intimidate triggers in the deck. Levia is just not a deck that's going to Intimidate unless you have Barraging Beatdown in, so not a good card for Levia. You could run maybe the blue in like club build if you wanted, but I don't think I would even do that. So this is kind of the bad batch of cards. I don't like them. I wouldn't put them in my Levia decks. So the next card here is Talisman of Recompense, and I think this is one of the only items that came out of the hundreds that did that Levia can really use, and that's because it is a safety net card, and Levia loves her safety nets. So whenever you pitch a card, and you would gain exactly 1, so when you'd pitch a red, you would destroy the Talisman and now gain 3 resources on the cost of that card. So all of a sudden, 2-card hand of like a dead Pulping and an Endless Maw becomes an Endless Maw. And that's really, really strong, especially since this has go again. So when you play it, you retain your action point to do something else. So in theory, if you could just start every game with one of these in play, like find it in your opening hand, drop it on the field, you would feel amazing going through that entire game. You'd now have tons of safety nets set up in Hope Merchant's Hood, the Talisman as well, that I would just always feel really confident about those Levia games. But how many of these do you really want in your deck to make finding them early likely? How many do you want where finding them mid-game isn't just horrible. I'm not quite sure there's potential that this really becomes a 3 of, honestly. It is that good for Levia, but right now I'd be tentative to just jam these in my deck because there's other things I want to try first. But this is definitely something I'm thinking about. And that's not to say that it would replace what Energy Potion is doing for the deck, because Energy Potion is in there specifically to beat Bravo when he comes at you with like a Crippling Crush, discards your hand with like a pummel as well you weren't expecting. Energy Potion now lets you crack it to still turn off Blood Debt from an attack in Arsenal. So Talisman isn't going to do exactly what Energy Potion did for you, but they're just extra safety net options. So I do want to see where this card ends up. I don't think it's overly obvious where it ends up in Levia, but I do definitely like it. So the next batch of cards here would be kind of the oddballs that aren't necessarily too obvious in Levia builds right now, but things that exist in our toolkit that we should always have on the back burner and start considering where they might fit in. So the first one here would be This Round's on Me. And this card's really interesting in that it kind of fills a similar role in what Gorganian Tome was doing for some Levia decks, in that it's just cycle. You play a card, draw a card, it goes to your graveyard to help you fit that banish 3 cost that your attacks have. But This Round's on Me is both better and worse in that it is a blue pitch 3 block. That's great. But then it does let your opponent draw a card with the extra text that your opponent's attacks are going to have -1 attack on their next turn. So I'm not quite sure this is good enough for Levia, because when you're racing and you play this card out, there's no guarantee that the card you draw is going to fit into a larger play. Adding the card to graveyard is great. Maybe you needed that to get your attack off, but if your attack is just, like an Endless Maw or something that turn, then you didn't provide some kind of crazy threat that your opponent is too incentivized to block out. So versus aggro, I just don't think the value is really there with this card. However, versus some control matchups where you're taking in your heavy recursion package, and that's where you're going to get a lot of your value from, This Round's on Me adds to your ability to now proactively fill graveyard, cycle from your cards, and get a lot of value out of your recursion pieces. So you could see this end up kind of in those builds, like a heavier anti-control Levia. But I'm not too sure if that's where we need to take the build right now. So the next thing to talk about would be Talisman of Cremation. And when this came out, a lot of people were saying, wow, this is Levia hate. I can't believe this. We didn't get anything good. We just got cards that hurt us more. And that's slightly true, but if there ever is a metagame where Talisman of Cremation's effect is very strong, we can actually use it really easily as well. So it's part of our now kind of sideboard toolkit that we have in like Arg Smash, these potentially silver bullet cards we could bring in when the time is right. So Talisman of Cremation says, when you play a card from your Banish Zone, which would be like Deep-Rooted Evil, Howl from Beyond, Ghostly Visit, destroy Talisman of Cremation and name a card. Banish all cards with the chosen name from each opposing hero's graveyard. So potentially with a really graveyard-focused hero, maybe in the future, or maybe Remembrance comes up like really strong, this is something now in our toolkit. And if played against us, sure, it could mess with how our graveyard is, but I just don't see that in the meta right now. I also don't see us playing it in the meta right now. It's just something that exists, right? Next card being even bigger than that. This was a card that, when spoiled, I really, really wanted to make work in Levia because I thought it made a lot of sense in that when you deal damage, I mean, your cards don't have a lot of hit effects, so your opponent's never like, oh, I'll block the full 6 every time, because what's the point of that? They'll just block whatever works for them. So if they, block 3 damage on your Hungering Slaughter Beast, well, now you've chipped in 4 because they weren't incentivized to cover the full thing, right? And then you get to trigger even bigger than that. You get to opt, reveal the top card. If it is more than the damage you dealt, which hopefully if they blocked one of your 6 or 7s, then it would be, because most of the things in your deck are going to be 6, you get to create a quicken and draw a card, and that card, of course, would be an attack you could arsenal. That all sounds good, but that's like Magical Christmas Land, because even bigger than that has its own drawbacks in that it's a no block. It's also no guarantee to actually proc. I mean, the only time it would work when your opponent just takes like a full 6 amount of damage would be when you reveal like a 7 attack or an 8 attack, which there's not many of in the deck. So I don't think this card is good enough to really play. It's definitely greedy, but it's something that, once again, exists. So we have to consider that maybe it finds a slot one day. So overall, yeah, not quite sure on these cards, but they're there. So then I want to talk about the biggest disappointment of the set. And that's because when Flesh and Blood on Twitter said that a card was coming that could be used to defend your allies, I was freaking ecstatic. There's only 2 cards in the game right now. or two classes in the game right now that have allies, and of course one of them is Levia with Doomsday summoning Blasphemfet, one of them is Chain with Eclipse summoning Urser. But the fact that they dropped this, I thought, man, this has to be the card that can really do something unique for Levia, because she is the more defensive deck between Chain and Levia, the two decks that have allies. So I was really excited. I wanted to see this card. I wanted to see what it could do. But instead, when it was dropped, we found out it was Amulet of Havencall. And Amulet of Havencall is so horrible for Levia. Like, I can't even describe how bad this card is for Levia, but we're going to give it a shot. So Amulet of Havencall, you get to play it. It has Go again. As a defense reaction, you can destroy it, search your deck for a card named Rally the Rearguard, add it to this chain link as a defending card, then shuffle. Now that part of the text sounds great. It's a Go again, so it's not going to take your action point to play it out. Rally the Rearguard is a card you can play in Levia because it is a 6 attack at red and can actually help discard some of your non-blocks. So it's a card that you could slot in your deck. That's all good and fine. But you can only activate this card if you have no cards in hand. And that is freaking garbage because Levia cannot win with no cards in hand. She needs a way to turn off Blood Debt turn after turn, and that's kind of the beauty of why Blasphemfet is out there. He can turn a 1-card hand into a way to turn off Blood Debt. So it doesn't matter that the fact that, yeah, you can destroy this, add Rally the Rearguard as a defending card to the chain link, and save Blasphemfet, because you will lose the game anyway. You have no cards in hand anymore to activate this ability, and so you can't turn off Blood Debt and you die. So I really was so disappointed with this card. I don't even know if it needed to have the only no cards in hand. Maybe it could say if you only had 1 card in hand, that would actually be good for how to use this in Levia. But as of now, freaking garbage. I'm so let down by this card. So big sad on this one. Some other missed opportunities in the set. I think KO's Specialization Ready to Roll is actually a really great card for just Brute in general. It would have been an amazing blue that we could have added to our decks that blocks 3, and it would have fixed some of the variance plays that come up with Brute when you're rolling Scabskins, or when you're rolling Thunder, or even if you're playing super aggro like in Blitz with Barkbone Strapping. This card could have just been great to try to piece together more consistent die rolls rather than just leaving it to luck of the die. But it's a KO spec, so we can't use it. And that feels horrible. Huge disappointment for me on this one. And yeah, KO's going to have a lot of fun with this card, but none of the other brutes will, and we're just going to look longingly at this ability to manipulate variance that we just no longer have. We're even being incentivized to not run Gambler's Gloves anymore and instead Skull Crushers. So really missed the mark on this one, honestly. So kind of to summarize what's happened for the Levia builds moving forward, and this is to say I don't have like publishable builds yet. I still need to get to testing this set, but I definitely will because I'm headed to SCG Philly, SCG Indy, 7 ProQuest, a Win-A-Box on Friday. I have a lot of things coming in the future for Flesh and Blood, and I will be putting tons of games in Levia on the hopes that she is still competitive. I thought the metagame was looking great for her, but a lot of other heroes gained a lot of really good cards, and we only gained some mediocre ones. So I hope she's great. As of now, what I'm confident in putting out there is that Claws Levia did gain Swing Big, Wild Ride for some builds, and Arcane Lantern. Club Levia gained Swing Big, of course, huge win there. Rolling Thunder, huge win there. Skull Crushers, huge win there. So Club Levia could be just the better deck right now. It's looking really strong for that build, thematic or not. But then the cards that are kind of to be determined, probably my number 1 and 2 of cards I want to test to see if they make it, would be Talisman of Recompense, and this round's on me. So that's kind of the spread of what Everfest did for Levia. Nothing too fantastic, unfortunately. None of these Majestics made our draws drop like they did for like Viscerai or Prism players, but that's just how it is. Maybe another set in the Savage Lands is coming our way soon and will give us some good toys. And then quick reminder for anyone who's free this Friday, I'm headed to a huge event for Everfest release at a local card shop here in Michigan. TC Sports is hosting a release event for Everfest this Friday where you get to buy a box for free entry, crack it, add those pulls to your Blitz decks, and then jump right into a tournament where there's boxes on the line, like 4 armory kits worth of cold foils and extended arts. So it's going to be a lot of fun. A lot of players that I know are headed out there. I'll be streaming it, in fact, opening boxes on stream, building and tweaking some Levia stuff on stream. So tune in this Friday, 5 p.m. EST. It'll be a lot of fun, hopefully. And maybe Levia takes this whole thing down, because she actually is looking pretty good in Blitz. So thanks for watching, guys, and don't give up.